Well, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to another in our lecture series. This is a lecture series that's put on by the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Core Texts and Ideas, which is the new Great Books undergraduate program here at the University of Texas. And we have brochures on a chair there and on a chair just outside that door. We welcome you to pick them up and inspect them. If you don't know about the program yet, we'd be glad to talk to you about it after class, after the lecture, or at our office, which is in Mezzi's Hall amongst the government department offices. Today it's a real pleasure as well as honor to welcome my old colleague at the University of Toronto, Professor Clifford Orwin, who is a professor there at the University of Toronto of political science and Jewish studies and international relations. He is a prolific author in political thought and political philosophy. He's the author of what is probably the best book in English on the political thought of Thucydides, called The Humanity of Thucydides, published by Princeton, and the author of many essays and articles and writings on a great range of political theory and political thought. In the last few years, he has become more and more interested in the political thought that emerges from the biblical and Judaic traditions. That kind of work is what is going to be reflected in his talk today, where he is going to be talking to us on the great confrontation and dialogue between God and Abraham over the fate of Sodom. Professor Orwin.
Yeah, I want to thank Professor Pangle for that kind introduction. As he mentioned, he and I were colleagues and friends for 25 years at Toronto. For those of you who've worked with him for 7, or even if you're undergraduates for much less than that, you'll have some idea of how much I must have learned from him in the course of those 25. And of course, Lorraine Pangle is no mean educator herself, and no doubt the Professors Stauffer have the Pangles hearing footsteps. So it's a great and daunting honor to have been invited into this seething cauldron of political philosophy, to say nothing of the outstanding Jefferson program that the Pangles have built here, which must foster audiences of uncommon discernment. In fact, the only thing about the present situation that no longer intimidates me is Texas itself. As I carefully planned this trip so that my previous stop was Alaska, the one state beside which yours looks downright puny. Now, given such a formidable venue as the Jefferson Center, you might have expected me to play it safe by lecturing on a work on which I may plausibly claim to be an expert. There are a couple of such works, but no, agreeing with Socrates that it's better to learn than to teach because more useful to oneself, I've decided to interpret a text in which I'm a relative newcomer and therefore an amateur. Indeed, truth compels the acknowledgement that this is one of a long line of books to which Professor Pangle, the husband, has gotten ahead of me. I actually have a deplorable record of getting to a book about 7 years after Professor Pangle has gotten to it, and therefore benefiting from his previous work. So I've consulted his fine interpretation, as I have some other noteworthy ones, but have persisted in many errors that are mine alone. There's another wrinkle to which I should probably confess. I mentioned that my last stop was in Alaska. Alaska is a very homey place, and in fact, I was staying in the home of my host there, and he asked me to do a wide number of things that weren't part of our original agreement. And one of the things that he asked me to do was to speak to his Lutheran Church Sunday school on the topic that on which I'm addressing you today. So I thought, all right, that would be a fine thing to do. And being Jewish, I regarded this as an opportunity for ecumenical outreach. So I made the presentation, not thinking that this would be an important event in the evolution of my thought about the passage. But as it turns out, these Alaska Lutherans are tough and shrewd people. You may have seen them on the Discovery Channel lately in their day jobs or pursuing the deadliest catch and so on. And in fact, their response to my presentation got me to thinking along different lines than I'd been thinking previously. So in fact, on the trip down here, because I came from Alaska to Texas via O'Hare Airport in Chicago, I actually was furiously writing a new lecture. And so I hope that what I'm about to say makes sense. I've tried to incorporate these new insights, but it may be that there will be a lot of loose ends that remain to be gathered up. In any case, I'm looking very forward to the questions and responses. So to that end, I've decided to keep my remarks to about 40 minutes to leave more time for discussion afterwards. Just one further prefatory or cautionary note. As I mentioned, I'm Jewish, and my interpretation of the Hebrew Bible is a Jewish one in as much as I don't approach it as the Old Testament, which as such must be understood as the precursor to the New. So I don't read it typologically as Christians typically did prior to the modern era, and as some have continued to do. That is, I don't read it as a series of anticipations of the life and passion of Jesus. At the same time, I must admit that neither do I interpret the Hebrew Bible as Jews have traditionally done, that is to say, through the eyes of the Talmudic sages. So I like to describe my approach, not entirely jokingly, as pre-rabbinic, by which I mean the attempt, however doomed, to take a fresh look at the text, freed from traditional preconceptions, whether Christian or Jewish. What were the intentions of the author or editor, as framed by the expectations of his readers, and do the concerns of author and reader still speak to us today? So my subject this evening is Abraham's intervention with God on behalf of the city of Sodom. This is justly one of the most famous passages of the book of Genesis, almost all of the passages of which are famous. And among Jews of today, as I've had occasion to observe, the episode evokes a certain complacent satisfaction, how righteous Abraham was and how righteous God was too. Well, maybe, but it still behooves us to examine the passage in the hopes of getting a handle on this righteousness, with an eye to seeing how it may guide us in our conduct of our human society. Nor should we take the uppityness of Abraham for granted, or assume that it should serve us as a model. Such human questioning of divine justice is without precedent in Genesis, and almost without sequel in it. Are we really to bask in what Abraham himself concedes may well seem an act of the greatest presumption? Does the outcome vindicate his protest as other than presumptuous? Is it really our business as human beings to tell God what to do? Now, like all passages of great literature, this one can only be understood in context. Its immediate context is furnished by Abraham's exemplary hospitality to the three strangers who appear to him before his tent at the terebinths of Mamre, of whom one proves to be God himself and the other two God's angels. The broader context is that of God's calling of Abraham, which has proved an ongoing process. Now, I just mentioned that this conversation over Sodom is commonly taken for a kind of proof text of Abraham's righteousness. It's worth noting that in their previous conversation, God had required righteousness of Abraham, but had disclosed nothing of the character of the righteousness so required. English-speaking readers know our passage is chapter 18. The previous conversation has occurred just before in chapter 17. What's most striking about chapter 17 is what entitles us to consider it as implying a covenant between God and Abraham, such as no earlier chapter has done. For it's here that God, for the first time, tells Abraham what he expects of him in return for his protection, and not just of him, but of all of his descendants forever. And what does that prove to be? Not a scroll's worth of moral laws, no ratcheting up of the handful of laws previously given to Noah, for instance, but just one thing very general and comprehensive, that Abraham, quote, walk with him and be blameless, or upright. The Hebrew word is tamim, and it's liable to a range of translations like most Hebrew terms. And one thing very specific, circumcision. Why circumcision? Certainly it's plausible to associate this newly enjoined practice with the righteous life that Abraham is to lead. Still, it seems rather odd that literally nothing here is disclosed of this righteous life, save for circumcision itself. So you might say that the sign of the covenant is all that we learn of the content of the covenant. Abraham thus accepts the burden of blamelessness without receiving any guidance from God as to what that means, and without asking God for any. Perhaps what we learn in chapter 18 is the seriousness with which Abraham accepts this responsibility, to the point of undertaking to remind God himself of just what blamelessness requires. Chapter 18 contains two distinct episodes linked by God's interior monologue at verses 16 through 20. And of the first of these episodes, I'll say only a very little today. Three strangers make their appearance before Abraham's tent at the terebinths of Mamre, while their guise is that of ordinary strangers, travelers. By verse 10, one of them discloses himself to be God himself, confirming his promise of the chapter before that Sarah will bear Abraham a child in a year's time. He thus reassures Abraham and announces for the first time in the hearing of Sarah that he will perform this crucial article of the covenant between them. In so doing, however, he makes no mention of that covenant or of his promise to make a great nation of Abraham or of the presumed righteousness of that nation, all of which we've heard in the previous chapter. He merely confirms his promise of a son. In the passage that immediately follows this episode, however, God's interior monologue, the long-term and broader considerations predominate. Abraham is seeing off his other two visitors, whom we're now told are God's angels, on their way to perform what we'll later learn is their mission in Sodom. Here we read merely that they looked down toward that city as they departed. God himself remains behind and launches on his interior monologue, which runs as follows. Shall I conceal from Abraham what I am about to do? For Abraham will surely be a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. For I have embraced him so that he will charge his sons and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham all that he spoke concerning him. This question, which we may take to be rhetorical, incorporates God's clearest statement yet of his intentions with regard to Abraham and the significance of his election of him. Not only or primarily because Abraham will be a great and mighty nation will the other nations of the world be blessed through him, but because that mighty nation will keep the way of the Lord and do righteousness and justice. We recall that in the previous chapter, Abraham was commanded not only to practice circumcision, but to be tamim, upright or blameless. Now God, in his interior monologue, suggests that the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham depends upon the righteousness of his people, his descendants, and what a stumbling block that will later prove to be, right, throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. This question also gives us, the readers, our first inkling, apart from the Sodomward glance of the angels, that God is about to do something, that he has business in Canaan today beyond confirming the impending birth of Isaac. What he has so far concealed from Abraham, the text is also concealed from us. We learn of it only as Abraham does. Having thus far spoken to himself, God now turns to speaking aloud, although only in the hearing of Abraham. And he says as follows, "The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, how great! Their offense is very grave. Let me go down and see whether, as the outcry that has come to me, they have dealt destruction. And if not, I shall know." Again, this is not just the first that Abraham has heard of God's misgivings about Sodom and Gomorrah, but the first that we readers have heard of them. Note God's curious manner of speaking. First, he pronounces, on the basis of the great outcry that has reached him, that the offense of the cities is very grave. Then, however, he implies that an outcry is just an outcry, that is to say, mere hearsay, and that he really must go down and see for himself. Perhaps the cities are innocent. If so, now he'll know. He doesn't disclose how he'll treat them if they prove guilty as charged. He goes no further than to specify their rumored offense, namely dealing destruction. Is he leaving us to infer that whosoever dealeth destruction, on him will destruction be dealt? It's hard not to suspect that God is playing dumb here, that he's practicing a kind of divine counterpart to Socratic irony, intended, like the Socratic version, to draw his interlocutor, that is to say Abraham, out. Can he possibly be as ignorant, as ill-informed of the truth about the cities of the plain as he here pretends? Can his intentions concerning them be as unformed as he here suggests? There are perhaps just two things that we can conclude for sure from this tantalizingly indeterminate passage. The first is that the intended business about which God was debating with himself whether to inform Abraham was the question of Sodom and Gomorrah. The second is that by disclosing this, he discloses also the result of that debate, for he has now informed Abraham of it. Oh, and perhaps a third thing, implicit but unmistakably so, that should the cities prove innocent, God will refrain from punishing them, right? You see, so God himself is concerned and expresses his concern lest he commit an injustice. Now, already this passage has given us an awful lot to chew on. Just what is the relation between God's initial question to himself, shall I conceal from Abraham what I am about to do, and the subsequent reminder of Abraham and his descendants' lofty calling? Because the question is whether Abraham is the human being uniquely qualified to be admitted to God's counsels. To none before him has been extended this privilege, not even Noah, who merely listened to God's commands and performed them. Or is it because the highest righteousness involves not only unquestioning obedience to God, but accepting responsibility for his undertakings? Because Abraham's exemplary hospitality to those whom he first took for human strangers confirms his readiness for this responsibility. Because even so, Abraham still requires much education if God's plan for him is to be fulfilled, and this conversation will further that education. The question of God's intention here is by no means an easy one. Abraham has some reason for apprehension concerning the fate of Sodom. Divine punishment of human beings is anything but an everyday event, but when it occurs, God can definitely be said to make a statement. For the record, can anyone recall when in the Bible God had last punished anybody? Yes, the deluge. You've got to go all the way back to the flood, right, which is many centuries before this event, to find an occasion on which God had punished anybody. Since the flood, not only has he not punished the species as a whole, but he has not punished any city or people belonging to it. He has not even punished any individual. He has dispersed the builders of the Tower of Babel, but that was by way of thwarting them, not punishing them, and all without harming so much as a hair on any of their presumptuous heads. So for quite a few centuries now, punishment has been absent from God's playbook. Yet, if God punishes rarely, he punishes harshly, thinking back also to the to the flood, so perhaps these might seem to go together. In any case, Abraham clearly infers, despite God's seeming hemmings and hawings, that the annihilation of the cities is imminent. He therefore approaches God. The text gives him credit for this initiative, as if the choice was his whether or not to respond to God's preceding comments, and he roundly reproves him for his presumed intention. The issue, as Abraham poses it from the outset, is whether God will destroy the innocent along with the guilty. So the text reads as follows. Abraham came forward and said, "Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" That wonderful last line, which deserves its place, I think, as one of the foundational statements of our civilization. As is clear from this opening gambit, Abraham presumes that God has pronounced upon the cities a total destruction. The famous discussion that follows goes no further than to consider whether this presumed intention should be performed. In this respect, it's very precise, very focused, but also a very limited discussion. So too is the issue very precise, stressed by Abraham alike at the beginning and at the end of his remonstrance. Will God, the judge of all the earth, commit the cardinal injustice of treating innocent and guilty alike, that is, of treating the innocent as if guilty? Now, before proceeding further, I will briefly turn to a modern source, which is to say a most unbiblical one. And that is Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which was the book of the year in political theory in 1974. There, Nozick makes the following point about criminal justice systems. He says, if you design such a system to convict as many of the guilty as possible, inevitably it will also convict the greatest number of the innocent. If, on the contrary, you design one to convict as few of the innocent as possible, it will also convict the fewest of the guilty. Okay, now, lest there's any part of this that you don't understand, I'll put it the other way around. Design a system whose priority is that the innocent never suffer punishment. A necessary consequence will be that neither then will most, or one could argue even any, of the guilty. Given the imperfection of every human system, Nozick argues, there's no escape from this dilemma. Now, even without having read Nozick, and even though the executor of justice in the present case is not human but divine, Abraham casts the case of Sodom as presenting this dilemma at its starkest. Either all the innocent will be spared, in which case so will all the guilty, or all the guilty will be punished, in which case so will all the innocent. Apparently anticipating the torrents of fire and brimstone that God will unleash on Sodom, he takes it for granted that such punishment will not discriminate between innocent and guilty. We are familiar with such torrents. The carpet bombings that devastated the cities of Germany and Japan during World War II, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Allied High Command made the decision not to be deterred by the massive slaughter of innocents. Will not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Again, this is a great and foundational saying. And it seems to me that it implies the problem of Plato's Euthyphro, a dialogue with which I hope some of you are familiar. That question being, is the holy such because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is holy? Here, is the just such because God does it, or does God do it because it is just? The first view would imply that God's actions are above human judgment. God will do what he will do, and whatever he does will be just because he has done it. The second view implies the opposite, that with his reputation of judge of all the earth to live up to, God can be counted on not to do anything but what is just. In principle, what is just is intelligible to human beings. All of us, after all, enter a claim, well considered or ill considered, explicit or merely implicit, to know what justice is. And this would mean that where God is behaving unintelligibly to us, and seems to be meditating injustice rather than the justice we have a right to expect from him, we are also within our rights to demand an explanation. Here, it seems to me, is a remarkable point of agreement between this passage and the Euthyphro. As a rationalist understanding of the holy as such ultimately implies a logos, a reason common to God and man, Abraham here assumes an understanding of justice common to God and himself, by appealing to which he can deter God from unjust actions. This may not be something he would do every day, or without fear and trembling, or in any case but the gravest and clearest, but the bottom line is that here he does it. Now, I don't want to suggest that the biblical understanding of the relations between God and man is a simply rationalist one. On the contrary, it is somehow equally necessary to the biblical perspective that God's actions be intelligible to us and that they not be so. As a wise man once remarked, it is impossible to conceive of the relations between God and man in a non-contradictory manner. In the present case, in any event, Abraham clearly presumes that he and God do share a common working definition of justice. Justice entails harming the bad, who being bad deserve harm, and abstaining from harming the good, who being good deserve no harm. Perfect justice would mete out harm to all the wicked and to none of the righteous. Abraham does not question the propriety of punishing the wicked. If there were no righteous men in Sodom, there would be no objection to annihilating the city. The issue here I want to stress isn't one of mercy versus justice, for while to spare the wicked may be merciful, mercy is not what Abraham invokes, but rather the injustice, not unmercifulness, of punishing the innocent, who in this case would suffer along with the guilty. Again, this must be stressed. To refrain from punishing the innocent is a requirement not of mercy, but of justice. The question under discussion then is not whether it's just to punish the guilty, it is, or whether it's just to punish the innocent along with them. It's not. But how many innocent there must be for their claim to impunity to outweigh the claim of the guilty to punishment? For the sake of how few of the righteous would God be willing to forego destroying the acknowledged vast majority of Sodomites who are wicked? At no point does Abraham suggest that Sodom might harbor more than 50 of the righteous. He knows enough of what goes down there to concede from the outset that any righteous in the city are an invisible and therefore no more than a tiny minority. Abraham leads God by stages to agree to spare the entire city for the sake of just 10 righteous men in it. The format of the discussion is the highly ritualized one of bargaining in a Near Eastern souk or market. Even Abraham's elaborate abasement of himself before God, while all the while nonetheless driving the hardest possible bargain, takes its place in the etiquette of such negotiations. I've seen this with my own eyes in the souk inside the old city of Jerusalem. Yet, if God and Abraham engage in the form of bargaining, they don't engage in its substance. And this, I think, would have very much surprised the original readers. I really think that nothing would have surprised the original readers of the passage more than this. In an actual case of bargaining, where the buyer is the first to propose a price, the seller endeavors to bargain him up. So the buyer says, I'll give you 50 shekels for your camel. And the seller replies, 50 shekels for that splendid beast, I won't take less than 100, right? Eventually, they meet somewhere in the middle, just as the seller had hoped but not supposed that the buyer would consent to pay 100, so the buyer hadn't expected the seller to agree to a price of just 50. In the present case, however, no such haggling occurs. When Abraham proposes 50 righteous men as a sum sufficient to justify sparing Sodom, God doesn't respond by demanding 100. Instead, he does what no bargainer would. He acquiesces in Abraham's initial offer. He thus leaves Abraham a free path to actually lower that offer, which Abraham proceeds to do. So this is not quite bargaining, really, but wheedling. And Abraham does it very cleverly. Note in particular how he accomplishes the descent from 50 to 45, by stressing just how insignificant a number 5 is. Quote, if the number of righteous falls just 5 short of 50, will you destroy a city for the sake of 5? Twice having persuaded God to come down by 5, Abraham switches his unit of bargaining to 10 and proceeds downward without missing a stitch. Yet in all of this, something is clearly and gloriously amiss. However surprised Abraham may be that God hasn't balked at his original offer of 50, he must anticipate God's resistance at lowering that number still further. In fact, however, God offers no resistance, readily acquiescing in each of Abraham's ever lower thresholds for the salvation of the city. If Abraham is trying God to see how solicitous he is of the fate of the righteous by seeing how low he'll go in defining the saving remnant, he can't be disappointed with the outcome. And if God is trying Abraham by seeing how low he will insist on God going in defining this remnant, then he can't be disappointed either. But note that Abraham doesn't try God's patience by going below 10. We never get to the 5 or to the 1 righteous man for whose sake the city should be saved. So it's never made explicit that any throng of the wicked, no matter how great, should be spared for the sake of any number of the righteous, no matter how small. So why isn't that made explicit? One possibility would be that this principle has been sufficiently established, and that for Abraham to continue his bargaining to the point of making this explicit would be superfluous and, in a sense, insulting to God. That Abraham is confident that having gone as low as 10, God has in fact demonstrated that he will spare the city for the sake of any righteous remnant, no matter how small. The conversation would thus anticipate the position of the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 5, verse 1, of the book that bears his name, that God would have spared the city of Jerusalem for the sake of a single righteous man in it. It would also anticipate the post-biblical Jewish teaching of the Lamed Vav, Hebrew for 36, the mere 36 righteous of every human generation, of every nation within that generation, for whose sake God saves the entire world. If this is the correct interpretation, then the implication of the passage would be the absolutist one, again, that any number of wicked, no matter how great, should be spared for the sake of any number of the righteous, no matter how small. In which case the punishment of cities would be unjust, except where all their inhabitants were wicked. Yet there's another way of interpreting Abraham's bargaining to 10 and no lower. It's that this expresses his concession that at some point in the continuum, the imperative of punishing the guilty will outweigh that of sparing the innocent. Abraham sets that threshold very low. If even 10 of the innocent would suffer, countless who are guilty must be spared. Still, he acknowledges that there is such a threshold, that if the innocent are few enough, they no longer warrant sparing a vast throng of the guilty for their sake. This intuition warrants further reflection, and in a few minutes we will accord it some. Perhaps this is the ultimate significance of the choice of the biblical author to present the discussion between God and Abraham in the form of bargaining. This format implies the lack of clear commensurability between the imperatives of punishing and sparing. Just as you can't state in advance what the outcome of any process of bargaining will be, so you couldn't state in advance the outcome here. Until what point does the necessity of sparing the innocent outweigh that of punishing the guilty? Where does our judgment and protest? This has to stop. We can't let all the guilty go free to accommodate the barest handful of the innocent. We can discover this tipping point, if you want to think of it in those terms, only by bargaining as God and Abraham do. Their bargaining proves merely nominal because they prove to be in perfect agreement. Yet, as I've also suggested, that agreement preserves an ambiguity implicit in their failure to descend from 10 to 1. This means that their agreement too is ambiguous, for it's possible that one of them understands it one way and the other one the other. Still, that Abraham will ask for and God acquiesce in, sparing so many guilty to avoid inflicting so few innocent as 10, seems to point to the strong priority that both God and Abraham assigned to the latter task, the task of afflicting the innocent. The commentators have speculated on the significance of the number 10. One has suggested that the number is proverbial for the family and implies that if a single righteous family is found, the city will be spared. But if our interlocutors are thinking in terms of families, then why has their entire discussion been couched in terms of individuals? Others have suggested that 10 is the minimum number of righteous required for the possible amelioration, eventual amelioration, or reform of an otherwise sinful city. For my part, however, I see no indication that the outlook of either God or Abraham is civic, that is, that they treat the city as a moral or political whole. Rather, it figures as a throng of individuals who are righteous or wicked, as the case may be. As I tell my students, we don't read the Bible to decode its, quote, politics, unquote. We read it to learn how the other half thinks. The biblical or Hebraic half, which in contrast with the Hellenic one, doesn't think politically. Not that you can't put this or that politics into the Bible, right? God knows it's been done often enough. It's just that you can't find any politics in the Bible. That would be my claim, that God and man have bigger fish to fry. In the event, of course, all the inhabitants of Sodom do prove wicked. Lot and his immediate family accepted, and these number not 10, but only 4. Does God spare the city for their sake? No. He destroys it utterly, except for them, utterly except for them. God isn't the prisoner of his technology of fire from heaven. After all, he also has angels to deploy. He can and does achieve perfect distributive justice in matters of punishment, punishing all who are wicked and sparing all who are innocent. So he achieves a more perfect justice than that for which Abraham had pleaded. Is this the lesson that Abraham must learn, that God's justice is not imperfect as human justice is imperfect? Does then the God of this episode provide us with any guidance as to how we should arrange these matters? Does he suggest by his seeming acquiescence in Abraham's suggestions that under circumstances of imperfect justice, we should lean towards, under the circumstances Nozick discusses, we should lean towards sparing the innocent, even at the cost of conferring impunity on many or even most of the guilty. This is a conclusion to which we should resist jumping. For as the very episode of Sodom has shown, the chief and urgent threat to the innocent is not such unjust punishment as they might suffer together with the just punishment of the guilty. The most urgent threat to the innocent is unjust oppression at the hands of those very guilty. You'll recall that immediately after Abraham's dialogue with God, the scene had switched to Sodom, which the angels entered just as they had first appeared to Abraham in the guise of ordinary men. Apparently ignored by the other residents, they had received hasty hospitality, such as the circumstances required, from Abraham's kinsman Lot. Yeah, we have to remember that in this epoch, hospitality was not a nicety, it was a matter of life and death, literally. Whereupon all the other Sodomites had turned on them and on Lot and his family with unsurpassed viciousness. When Lot had attempted to dissuade them, they made it clear that they'd brook no righteousness from the likes of him. Quote, "This person came as a sojourner, and he sets himself up as a judge. Now we'll do more harm to you than to them." So Lot and his family, the sole righteous residents of Sodom, would have perished had the wicked majority not been thwarted by the supernatural powers of the angels, upon which the angels had announced to Lot that they would spirit him and his family away as God had sent them to destroy the city. We can now see the problem with Abraham's position. He spoke as if the righteous and the wicked lived side by side in a city without interaction between them. Yet it is precisely such interaction on display in Sodom that discloses them, that identifies them as righteous and wicked. It confirms that the punishment of the wicked is no less urgent a task than the sparing of the righteous, indeed is a necessary means to or condition of it. If the punishment of the guilty appears intolerable, as it does to Abraham, when it entails the suffering of the innocent, all the more so does the impunity of the guilty, which equally entails woe to the innocent. If the dialogue between God and Abraham makes a moving case for sparing the innocent, the adventure of the angels in Sodom underscores the necessity of punishing the guilty. It's easy to sympathize with Abraham's position in his dialogue with God, the more so in that God himself appears to do so. What could be more unjust and so more horrible than to punish the innocent along with the guilty? Both Abraham and we, insofar as we aspire to justice, have a stake in this outcome. For Abraham, aspiring to justice in a world full of wickedness and a member of a human race which God has already destroyed once for its wickedness, Abraham naturally craves the reassurance that he can count on this still mostly unknown God's promise to protect him in return for his justice. There's also the matter of Lot, whom we may suppose that Abraham presumes to have remained innocent even while residing in Sodom. And yet Abraham, however righteous, is but a man, and like every human character in the Bible, falls far short of perfect wisdom. The episode as a whole teaches what Abraham has failed to grasp, that solicitude for the innocent cannot, without self-contradiction, support leniency toward the guilty. The justice for which Abraham pleads is one-sided. Quote, "Shall the judge of all the earth deal unjustly," unquote, proves as potent an objection to the policy that he urges on God as to that from which he thinks to deter him. Justice no more permits us to treat the guilty as though innocent than to treat the innocent as though guilty. God's justice avoids both pitfalls. Human justice will struggle in vain to do so as it vacillates restlessly between Nozick's two poles. Okay, thank you.